Hey, good evening, everyone. Some of you may recall that at the beginning of the second lecture, I believe it was, I warned you that if you kept coming out of these numbers, the shul would turn it into a fundraiser. I had no idea, really. But in all seriousness, though, the shul does do some really great programming. If you enjoyed what you've heard over the past 3 weeks, those of you who are listening online or the recordings, if you've enjoyed this or any of the other incredible programs that BRS does, by all means, they're running their global campaign now. If you can't see this in the video, but you have the card. If you enjoy what you've experienced, you've learned something, you've been inspired by it, by all means, go online and show your support for the shul and its incredible programming. So we are in the fourth of our 4-part series called The Winds of Change. We have been deep into this world of the 19th century. Every time we look at it again, it gives us a headache. But I think hopefully at this point, we're getting more and more familiar with some of the events that transpired over the course of this really monumental century that changes the landscape of Jewish history. So last time we were talking about something called the Haskalah, and we traced its roots to an early period in the southwestern part of what used to be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an area known as Galicia, which is really where the story began amongst a very small group of intellectuals that we pointed out that really moved quite seamlessly between the world of Western European Enlightenment and the traditional world of Eastern Europe. But we noted that the Galician Haskalah really doesn't take off in its particular environs, but it does set the stage for something that will come later, which is known better as the Vilna Haskalah. All of this together is known as the Russian Haskalah. But the Vilna Haskalah, we said, really takes off in the late 1840s and then 1850s. The result primarily of 2 different factors. One were the early seeds planted by the Galician Haskalah, which was beginning to critique the pieces of traditional society that it saw as more backward or more belonging to a time in the past, but was also calling for real reform in Jewish education, in the way that Jews become and educate themselves. And that really becomes a critical piece of the platform of those who are thinking about the Vilna Haskalah, because it works quite well with what the government was doing at the very same time, right? And these 2 forces will combine not only to give these intellectuals in the Vilna circle the support of a government that wanted similar aims, but also gave them financial freedom from the Jewish community itself by creating this system of state-run Jewish schools, which, as we saw as we went through the biographies of a number of these different thinkers and writers, we noted that so many of them got their employment within this world of the state, either rabbinical seminaries or state schools, which allowed them to voice their opinions, write more freely, which really sets the stage for a monumental change. In 1855, as Tsar Nicholas loses the throne and Alexander II comes in and takes the throne, which we said happens right on the heels of the Crimean War, a war which was a disaster for Russia. Alexander comes in, decides it's time to modernize Russia. It has to be brought into up to speed with the great powers of the West. This explains the real explosion of Haskalah over the next few decades, because now you have a moment in which their surroundings, Jews are living in a place that feels like the winds of change are blowing. Right now, it is time to modernize. It is time to open ourselves up. We're living in historical times, we'll say, the writers of the Haskalah. If only we modernize ourselves, right? Not so much about what we're doing in shul or aren't doing in shul, not having much to do with whether we're following the Shulchan Aruch or not keep following the Shulchan Aruch. We mentioned a number of times that the Haskalah, and this will be important for today's story, right? The Haskalah, although that word means enlightenment, when thought of in an Eastern European context, it is much better translated as the movement of Jewish romanticism. Right? It is a way of creating a modern Jewish European culture that takes the best of what Jews had in some past time, whether real or imagined, but takes that and brings that back, recaptures it, right, and puts it back into place in an exalted fashion that modernity now has to offer. And that's what the Vilna Haskalah was all about. It was primarily a literary movement. These were writers, they were journalists, they were novelists, they were essayists, they were poets, all of whom were trying to recapture or recreate, or to be honest, create for the first time, right, a more modern Jewish culture, a more modern European Jewish culture. We noted, though, that all of this, right, will take a very serious turn or will be impacted greatly, right, by the events of 1881. The events of 1881, the assassination of Alexander II, that czar who heralded this new time of openness, will be replaced by a czar who will return the iron fist to the throne in Russia, as well will sit by as a number of pogroms break out. And more than the physical damage that is done in 1881 is the psyche of the Jewish people as a whole, the Eastern European Jewish community that is affected by 1881. So we talked about three, and then we added one more, right, impacts that we see in Jewish community post-1881. The first is that in the traditional community, right, if there were those who were straddling the two sides, if it was easy to go back and forth between the more maskilic, right, circles and traditional circles post-1881, that's pretty much over, right? The traditional circles will say, listen, this proof is in the pudding. Right? Making yourself more modern, more European, elevating Jewish culture, writing poetry doesn't get you anywhere. Right? Doesn't get you anywhere. In fact, there was a pogrom in Odessa. Odessa was the capital of Jewish enlightenment. It doesn't get you anywhere. Right? So time to return to the thing that really makes us who we are, right? And that is our Jewish tradition. It is the way we've practiced our Judaism for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so you begin to see the separation of these camps in a pretty significant way, and the articulation in the traditional camp, in the world of Torah Jewry, of a vicious critique on the world of Haskalah. Number two, you will see those who were in that more enlightened camp. Many of them will begin to find their way into the world of radical politics, either amongst those who were known as anarchists, or more prevalently into the world of Jewish socialism. Some of you may be familiar with the Allgemeine Bund for Yiddish Arabic and Russian Poland, right? Otherwise known as the Bund. Right? The Bund gets its start now. This is a particularly Jewish organization for Jewish socialism, for Jews getting organizing themselves around the ideas of socialism, which was a way of fighting back against what they were experiencing vis-a-vis Alexander III and this new return to autocracy in Russia. The last piece that we spoke about in any length last time was the mass emigration. Right? Mass emigration, which is almost exclusively for the shores here of the United States. We said between 1881 and 1924, 2.5 million Jews will leave Eastern Europe for the shores of the United States. But of course, there is a fourth very important piece of this picture, and that is the rise of Zionism as we know it, and that is our story for today. So, you guys know who's behind that? Okay, I'm impressed. That was a test. Okay, good. So the story of Zionism, I find, first of all, the story is not well enough known in our community or in our day schools. End of story. But when we do teach about Zionism and we do tell the story of the rise of Zionism, I find at least that is almost exclusively taught in a Western European context. One might actually come out of a history of Zionism thinking that Zionism is something that started in Western Europe and until the founding of the modern state. So it goes something like this. You have this Viennese journalist pondering life's bigger thoughts here in Vienna, who ultimately makes his way on assignment to Paris in order to cover the Dreyfus trials. After that, he writes a book in German called Der Judenstaat. Not that long afterwards, they hold a big conference of all the people who are interested in Judaism, in Zionism, held where? In Basel, Switzerland. Okay, good. We got Vienna, we got Paris, we got German, we got Basel, Switzerland, right? And then, of course, the English show up as part of the story, right? With their white paper, the Balfour Declaration, right? Ultimately, their control of what was then Palestine in the beginning of the story. We don't like the British. We like the British at the end of the story. We don't like the British, right? And then ultimately, voila, we have a declaration, right, of independence in 1948. And so you look at this story, and it certainly seems like a story that has its roots in Western Europe. A story, by the way, which we tell ourselves, and I will say also adds to the story, it gives power or fuel to those who want to understand the history of Zionism as a history of Western colonialism. Right? And this, to some degree, I think, right, paints or at least allows for some of that picture. But the truth of the matter is, and I hope you will understand as we come out of tonight's lecture, that the story of Zionism actually is not a Western European story much at all. Right? It is a story of Eastern Europe. Right? It is a story that we've been telling and very much needs to be seen, right, in this context, right, rather than the context of Western Europe. So let's tell the story then. The story of Zionism starts with a group of writers often referred to as proto-Zionists. Right? The first of whom is the Rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. And by the way, the story of proto-Zionism is not an Eastern European story. It is, as you'll see in just a moment. He is actually born in Sarajevo, in the Ottoman Empire. He will study in Yerushalayim, but ultimately go back to what is currently Serbia, and he will be a teacher, like many of the other intellectuals that we've encountered so far. Serbia, interestingly, is one of the first countries in Eurasia to begin to go through this process of nationalism. Already by 1804, Serbia is trying to assert its own independence. There's a whole series both of revolts and then legislation that will happen between 1804 and 1835, which is exactly the time, right, that Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai is living in this area and experiencing, right, seeing the people around him who are fighting for their own national identity, to become their own country or to go back to what they perceived as a history that had been lost. And that's important, and as we'll see, will become important. He writes a book called Minchas Yehuda in 1843, in which he will argue that Geula has several steps to it. And there is a first step referred to in our writings as Mashiach ben Yosef, and that step of the Geula is one that is supposed to be initiated by mankind, by human beings. Right? Mashiach ben David, that is something we wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do. But Mashiach ben Yosef, that is something that has to be done by the people themselves through their own initiative. He will argue that in order for this to work, there needs to be a restoration of Hebrew as a Jewish language. He will actually have a very practical plan in mind. He suggests that Jews start buying land in what was the land of Israel, and he gives a perfect example. He says this is the way that Avram Avinu did it. Right? He literally bought land, right, around Ma'aras HaMachpelah, and so we need to start doing the same thing, raising money in order to buy land in the land of Israel. He also argues that in order for this to work, we're going to need agriculture in order to sustain ourselves in this land. That's Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. Rabbi Alkalai is often paired with Rabbi Tzvi Kalischer, who is living in a very different place. Rabbi Tzvi Kalischer is living in Prussia, right? Again, Prussia, they speak what language? German. Okay, good. Right. So he's born in Lisa. He studies with Rav Yaakov of Lisa. Rav Yaakov of Lisa. Anybody know that name? Yes. Very good. Okay, good. Right. There's Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa is the author of the Nesivos. We met last time the author of the Ketsos. Right now we have the author of the Nesivos. We're covering all the Yeshiva Achronim. Right. And he studies with Rabbi Kiva Eger as well. Right. So this is a first-rate Talmid Chacham. Right. Rabbi Yehuda Kalischer. In 1862, it's a good 20 years after the publication of Minchas Yehuda, he will write a sefer called Drishat Zion. In it, he will argue that the resettlement of Israel is necessary because of the poverty that he sees the Jewish people living in, and the assimilation that he is experiencing and seeing. Again, he lives, right? Prussia is sort of this. I mean, it's certainly German. Culturally German, but he's aware of what's happening in Eastern Europe, and he's seeing the assimilation. So he's aware of the poverty, right, that's growing in Eastern Europe. Remember, we talked about the population explosion and what that will do to the Jewish community in Russia over the course of the 19th century, and poverty will become increasingly worse and more of a problem over the course of the century. And over on the West, right, he sees what's happening with the advent of reform, right, and the growth of assimilation in the Western states. So he sees Israel and the resettlement of Israel as a potential solution to both of these problems. He recognizes that it's going to require support, right, from global support for this to take off. And he too will advocate that this is going to require Jews beginning to work the land. And just again, consider a Talmud of Rabbi Kiva Eger, Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, people for whom Torah study really has been the utmost priority, understanding, and now beginning to advocate that it is not only okay, but ought, right? It's something we ought to do, to take time away from study of that sort in order to learn how to be a farmer. Jews didn't know how to farm, right? We got to start somewhere. We got to learn, right? This was part of his program as well. The thing that he is most probably known for and probably most controversial in any of his writings was this last piece. And he actually makes a halachic argument that it would be possible to renew bringing sacrifices, karbanos, in the land of Israel in the modern day. And as you can imagine, that certainly attracted quite a bit of attention. The third member of this group of proto-Zionists is a man by the name of Moses Hess. As you can tell just from his appearance, he looks a little different than Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer did or Yehuda Alkalai. Moses Hess is living in Bonn, the German city, which was under French rule at that time. He studies at the University of Bonn at about the same time as another famous Jew is at the University of Bonn. Not Marx? I think I heard it somewhere. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch learns, also studies in the University of Bonn. That is the entirety of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's secular education. Happens in 1 year in Bonn. He never graduates. Moses Hess marries a Catholic woman. He is not, as you can see, a very religious Jew in any way, shape, or form. He is actually a personal friend. Maybe that's why the name Marx and Engels came up, but I don't think they were studying in Bonn. Were they? I'm not sure. I don't think they were. But yes, they were absolutely personal friends. And he was obviously very influenced by what was happening in the 1840s, by the nationalist revolutions that were taking place throughout Europe as a whole during that period. And he will publish a work called Rome and Jerusalem in 1862. In it, he will argue that Jews they're a nation, they're a nationality, and as such, they will never be accepted amongst the nations of Europe. They are different and will always be different, right? And therefore, there needs to be some sort of Jewish nationality, Jewish state, right, that he envisioned would be a socialist state in the land of Israel. So Moses Hess's work actually is not very well read. Moses Hess in his lifetime is not very well known, as opposed to somebody like Rabbi Haskalah, who is very influential and very active in the world of early Zionism. Moses Hess is not, and he's not that well known. But Moses Hess's work is important for highlighting the fact, right, that the rise of early Zionism happens right in this context, right? You can't understand the rise of Zionism without recognizing that the entirety of Europe was dealing with nationalist revolutions in the middle of the 19th century. Remember, if we go back early enough, right, Napoleon had tried to make one universal state, right, out of the known world at the time, certainly all of Europe, and then into Russia. That was his vision, universalism. We're all going to be the same. We're going to have the same enlightened French culture, and he was going to bring it to the world. Well, when Napoleon fails and he's chased back to Paris, in its wake comes this rise of nationalistic fervor. We don't want to be French. Right? We want to be Irish, or we want to be German, or we want to be Hungarian. We want to be Italian. We want to be who we are and who we identify as and have identified for years, not part of some sort of universalistic, right, global culture. And so this is happening throughout Europe at the time. All of these places, right, will experience revolutions, all non-unsuccessful, which is why we don't know them so well today, right? Because they are all put down. In some places, they succeed in pushing for new reforms within their countries, but none of them actually create a new state. But it is in this environment that people like Moses Hess are beginning to look around them. And it causes two realizations. Number one, it is possible to fight, right? To restore a people's nationhood. Right? That having a land is really tied in with what it means to have a culture. Right? And if everybody's fighting to restore who they are, who are we? Right? We're not any of them. We're not German, we're not French, we're not English, we're not Irish, we're not Swedish, we're not Hungarian. And even if we have tried to be in the past, even if we had movements that said all we need to do, right, is to change the way we dress, change the way we talk, change the language that we speak, and then we'll be one of them, well, it's become really clear, right, that that's not going to happen. And so it's time to create our own. So, Early Zionism comes along as a result of a number of things. We spoke last time about the way in which, particularly in and around the Vilna Haskalah, there was a rebirth of Hebrew. Before Zionism was really on the map, there was talk about revitalizing Hebrew because they were going through this sort of romantic period of let's go back to our roots, right, and bring that forth as our modern European culture. We have something to contribute. It's the Bible. It's the language of the Bible. It's Hebrew. It's ours. We need to recultivate it. That's Yehuda Leib Gordon, right? And all the early Hebrew writers in the Vilna Haskalah. So that's already happening before Zionism really begins to make its mark. There is rising nationalist sentiment throughout Europe. There is, for those for whom this is important, there were the religious groundwork that was being set by works like Rav Alkalai and Rav Kalisher. The pogroms will obviously, this by the way is a French newspaper covering the pogroms in Eastern Europe, the pogroms against Jews, obviously. This will accelerate the need for a homeland, right, that isn't just a place of culture, but a place of refuge. Right? And then there is this widespread disillusionment, right, with the original aims of the Haskalah that said we can be a Jew a Jew at home and a Russian, right, in the street. Right? Well, no, actually, right, you can't be a Russian in the street anymore. No one will give this greater clarity or leadership in the early period of Zionism than a man by the name of Dr. Leon Pinsker. Leon Pinsker is born in a small town of Tamashov. He was hired first his father was hired as a teacher, right, at a state school in Odessa, right? You get we see the trend at this point. So he moves to Odessa. He's already being raised in a family, and if his father's teaching in a state school, it tells you something about what the values in the home were. He will attend Odessa University. I believe he actually first wanted to study law, but law was not open as a profession, would not have been open to him as a Jew. But medicine was, and so he studies medicine, becomes a physician. So he's Dr. Pinsker. He is a medical physician. We will see some of that in his writing. In 1881, immediately following the outbreak of the pogroms, the assassination of Alexander, and the outbreak of pogroms, he will found a group called Chovevei Tzion. Chovevei Tzion, simply a group of a confederation of local groups, all of whom believed in this idea of resettling the land of Israel. It is this work, though, in 1882, this work called Auto-Emancipation, which really will coalesce these groups, even though it was also written in German. The ideas behind it will begin to percolate, begin to spread, begin to appear in the writings of the Hebrew Jewish newspapers. Auto-emancipation means self-help, means help ourselves. Why do we have to help ourselves? Because nobody else is going to do it, right? In the beginning of the book, right at the outset, he places this quote from Pirkei Avos: "Imin ani li mili, v'im lo achshav imatai." Right? If I'm not for myself, who will be? And if not now, when? Right? This is the time. This is the moment, he says. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever read pieces of auto-emancipation. It's not as well read as the Yudenstadt, but we're going to read some of this together because I think you're going to find a few things. First of all, you're going to find pieces that probably resonate with the world that we live in today, but you'll also be able to see how this is very much a product of the things we've been talking about, right, that have been happening in 19th century Eastern Europe up until this point. And you'll also, if you look carefully, see pieces of Dr. Pinsker, the physician. So here we go. This is the kernel of the problem, as we see it. The Jews comprise a distinctive element among the nations under which they dwell, and as such, can neither assimilate nor be readily digested by any nation. Hence, the solution lies in finding a means of so readjusting this exclusive element to the family of nations that the basis of the Jewish question will be permanently removed. An equality of this kind did exist in the now long forgotten past. But unfortunately, under present conditions, the prospect that will readmit the Jewish people to the status of nationhood is so remote to seem illusory. What do we see in this sentence? An equality of this kind did exist in the now long forgotten past. What is this? This is romanticism, right? This is part of the Vilna Haskalah. This is part of that same project, right? Of going back to something that we've once lost. We once had this flourishing Jewish nation. It's time to go back to our roots, but now it's gone. It lacks the most essential attributes by which a nation is recognized. It lacks that autochthonous, good word, life in which is inconceivable without a common language and customs and without cohesion in space. Jews don't all look the same. They don't all speak the same language. They dress differently. They speak differently. We aren't a nation in any visible sense of the world, and we don't clearly live in a single space. The Jewish people has no fatherland of its own, though many motherlands. No center of focus or gravity, no government of its own, no official representation. They home everywhere, but are nowhere at home. The nations have never to deal with a Jewish nation, but always with mere Jews. The Jews are not a nation because they lack a certain distinctive national character inherent in all other nations, which is formed by a common residence in a single state. But the greatest impediment in the path of the Jews to an independent national existence is that they do not feel its need. Not only that, but they go so far as to deny its authenticity. Who's the problem, according to? We are. It's the Jews who don't realize we have a problem, right? That are our biggest problem. In the case of a sick man, Dr. Pinsker, the absence of desire for food is a very serious symptom. It is not always possible to cure him of this ominous loss of appetite. And even if his appetite is restored, it is still a question whether he will be able to digest his food, even though he desire it. There's a loss of appetite amongst the Jewish people. For what? Nationhood, right? And that's a serious symptom. That's a symptom of somebody on their deathbed. Right? The end is near. The Jews are in an unhappy condition of such a patient. We must discuss this most important point with all possible precision. We must prove that the misfortunes of the Jews are due above all to their lack of desire for a national independence, and that this desire must be awakened and maintained in time if they do not wish to be subjected forever to disgraceful existence. In a word, we must prove that they must become a nation. Judeophobia, this is the word he prefers to anti-Semitism. The word anti-Semitism does exist at this point, but he prefers this word Judeophobia, is a variety of demonopathy with the distinction that it is not peculiar to particular races, but is common to the whole of mankind. So demonopathy refers to a particular groups of people who believe that demons exist, right, and have to do all sorts of things to dispel them. That, he says, is true amongst certain groups of people. And Judeophobia is a similar thing, except that it's not limited to a few groups of people, which he calls races here, but it's true about all people. They all have this illness, right? And that this ghost is not disembodied like other ghosts. The thing that they're afraid of, this ghost that they're afraid of, isn't some sort of spirit in the air, right? But partakes of flesh and blood. It's us, right? We're people, Jews. It's Jews that they fear. We're the demons, right? And must endure pain inflicted by the fearful mob who imagines himself endangered, right? So they see themselves as endangered by us. But the problem is when you hit a ghost, he doesn't bleed, right? When you hit a Jew, he bleeds. Judeophobia is a psychic aberration. As a psychic aberration, it is hereditary. And as a disease transmitted for 2,000 years, it is incurable. To sum up then, to the living, the Jew is a corpse. To the native, a foreigner. To the homesteader, a vagrant. To the proprietor, a beggar. To the poor, an exploiter and a millionaire. To the patriot, a man without a country. For all, a hated rival. National self-respect. Where can we find it? It is precisely the great misfortune of our race that we do not constitute a nation, but are merely Jews. We are a flock scattered over the whole face of the earth, and no shepherd to protect us and bring us together. At best, we attain the rank of goats, which in Russia are mated with racehorses. And that is the highest reach of our ambition. If other national movements which have risen before our eyes were their own justification, right? He's talking about the other national movements. He's seen it. He's seen what's happened over the course of the last few decades in the 19th century in Europe. If other national movements which have risen before our own eyes were their own justification, can it still be questioned whether the Jews have a similar right? They play, that is the Jews, a larger part in the life of civilized nations. They have rendered greater service to humanity. They have a greater past and history, a common unmixed descent, an indestructible vigor, an unshakable faith, and an unexplained martyrology. The peoples have sinned against them more grievously than against any other nation. Is that not enough to make them capable and worthy of possessing a fatherland? The struggle of the Jews for national unity and independence as an established nation not only possesses the inherent justification that belongs to the struggle of every oppressed people, but it is also calculated to win the support of the people by whom we are now unwanted. This struggle must become an irresistible factor of contemporary international politics and destined for future greatness. Believed Dr. Leon Hess that all we need to do, right, is bring the world this idea, and they're going to agree, right? Because they don't want us here anyway either, right? So we've got all the makings of the perfect argument. It's just up to us, right, to now put it on the agenda. The goal of our present endeavors must not be the Holy Land, but a land of our own. This is a secular Jew, before Uganda, right? Long before Uganda, right? But it's the same idea. Right? This is a secular Jew, right? A Jew, his father was already part of the Vilna Haskalah, right? Moving to Odessa as a teacher in the state schools. We need nothing but a large tract of land for our poor brothers, which shall remain our property and from which no foreign power can expel us. There we shall take with us the most sacred possessions which we have saved from the shipwreck of our former country. The God idea, so he still does very much believe in God, right? And the Bible. It is these alone which have made our old fatherland the Holy Land and not the Jerusalem or the Jordan. Meaning it is the fact that these places that we brought God to Jerusalem, that we brought the ideas, right, of the Bible to these places, that's what made them what they were. So we can take them someplace else. Perhaps the Holy Land will again become ours. If so, all the better. But first of all, we must determine, and this is the crucial point, what country is accessible to us, at the same time adapted to offer the Jews of all lands who must leave their homes a secure and indisputed refuge capable of productivization. We're almost done. We do not overlook the enormous external and internal difficulties involved in this, which is to be the lifelong endeavor of our people. Most difficult of all will be the attainment of the first and most necessary prerequisite, the national resolution. For we are, to our sorrow, a stiff-necked people. How readily could conservative opposition, of which our history has so much to tell, nip such a resolution in the bud? If it should, then woe to our entire future. The international Jewish question must have a national solution. Of course, our national regeneration can only proceed slowly. We must take the first step. We must take the first step. Our descendants must follow us at a measured and not over-precipitant speed. The national regeneration of the Jews must be initiated by a Congress of Jewish notables. No sacrifice should be too great for this enterprise, which will assure our people's future everywhere endangered. The financial execution of the undertaking does not present insurmountable difficulties. Help yourselves, and God will help you. What year did we say this was written? 1882. Right? 1882 is 15 years prior to the World Zionist Congress, the first Zionist World Congress. In 1884, it is Dr. Pinsker who will organize the first conference of Zionist leaders. This is the invitation that went out to the major leaders of world Jewry at that time, primarily rabbis, and invites them to this conference in Katowice, right, which that's the Yiddish pronunciation, right, which was at that point in Germany. Again, another reason why some may mistake this as being a Western European endeavor, but in fact, of the 32 delegates who attended this first Zionist conference, 22 of them are from Russia. At it, Pinsker, Dr. Pinsker, will be elected the chairman of this new group, and somebody who we are about to meet, Rabbi Shmuel Hilleber, will be elected its president. This is a picture of the delegates. What do you notice? Yeah, I can't. Okay. I think I heard some good things up there. So first of all, clearly nobody is happy about photo time. Okay, that is clear. I would add that probably a good percentage of them don't even know how to take a picture, right? As they are looking in all sorts of directions, right? Okay, excellent, good. Right, so I'm going to get to that point in just a second. I'm just first going to point out that this guy did not like the dinner they served, right? But I like the way it was described back there a little bit better. I think there's a really interesting mix here, right? Of those who are wearing yarmulkes and those. Oh no! If they're not wearing it, it's not there for sure, right? But there's a significant group here, right? That not just the Roman, this guy in the back also, right? There's this is a mixed group, right, of people who are wearing yarmulkes and those who are not wearing yarmulkes. And that is indeed the way in which the Zionist movement in Eastern Europe will start. And it is very much mixed between those who are coming from a secular background, more secular background, right, and those who are not. This is Dr. Leon Pinsker. Also we're terribly excited, right, to be there. But this was a landmark gathering. In 1887, Chovevei Zion will take the name Chibat Zion. In 1890, Chibat Zion will have 130 chapters with 14,000 members. That is 6 years before Herzl will write Der Judenstaat. Right? So to think that Zionism begins with an Austrian journalist, right, is clearly not the case. Right? He will come on this scene, right, and very much benefit from what has been happening in Eastern Europe for 2 decades already at that point. Right? But this is where the story begins. Shortly after this, the pogroms in Elisabethgrad, actually the first settlers will get up and go to the land of Israel to try and create agricultural settlements in Israel. The first settlement being Rishon LeZion, hence its name, started by 10 members of Chovevei Zion, who were from Kharkov, Ukraine. These were university students who, again, we would say belong to that community of the Vilna Haskalah, who are now realized there is no future for modern Jews, enlightened Jews in Eastern Europe, make their way to the land of Israel. They will shortly be joined thereafter by a group known as Bilu. Bilu stands for? Why do you guys even come? You know it already. Right. Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha. Beit Yaakov? Huh? Okay. It stands for Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha, right? That the house of Jacob should get up and go. Yes, they left out the end, right, which says that they should do so in the light of God. Bilu was also a group of more secular young people from Russia. They looked to purchase agricultural areas to be able to settle it and create these agricultural communities in Israel in the 1880s. They had 525 members in 1882. Of the 525, how many actually settle in the land of Israel? Oh, you don't know everything. Okay, 14. 14 will actually make it there permanently in Israel, largely because it becomes extremely difficult to actually get land. Right? The Arabs will actually protest these first. They will go to their Ottoman rulers, and it will become very difficult for them to acquire land that was seen as fit for agricultural settlement. So only 14 will actually make it. Again, they will help strengthen first the community of Rishon LeZion, and then they will, in 1884, they will go out and start the community of Gedera. At the end of the story, the entire story of Bilu, about 60 members of Bilu will make it to the land of Israel, but this does mark what is known as the beginning of the first Aliyah. This is the beginning of Jews in the modern period going to Israel in order to establish what were imagined to be and hoped to be self-sustaining agricultural settlements in the land of Israel. That is, there were Jewish communities there already. Right, both Sephardic and Ashkenazic. In fact, students of the Vilna Gaon have been coming now for almost 100 years, but those were not self-sustaining communities. They depended almost exclusively on support from outside, from the diaspora in order to live. The vision here was to create self-sustaining communities. Is there a question? Yeah.
The large majority of the first settlement codes were religious. I've been there to the museum and I see the pictures of almost all. In fact, there were some members who had a picture statement that the religiosity didn't have a picture statement. They had separate schools for girls and boys, and the problem they had was they couldn't convince more religious Jews to come from Russia. Then it became non-religious.
Okay, so this story of the religious nature of the early settlers is part of our story, and as you will see, it becomes a very, very hot button issue over the course of the next 2 decades. The first settlers who went there were not, right? They were not. They were again, the first 10 who went, right? We're not. The community that begins to develop there, you are right, right? In Rishon LeZion, they will become, that is where more of the religious people will go, as opposed to Gedera, right? In which will be largely non-religious amongst it. But even these terms we have to be careful with, right? What exactly is religious or isn't religious? But you are right? That Rishon LeZion will develop a more religious settler base early on. Which is why almost all of the ire that we'll talk about later is directed at the Toshvei Gedera, who are openly being Mechalel Shabbat. You do not have the same reports early on in Rishon LeZion. So you're absolutely right. Okay. The next person who's really important to our story is a man by the name of Asher Ginsburg. Asher Ginsburg, best known by his pen name, Haskalah. Okay. Hanan is raised in a traditional and actually relatively wealthy home. He is autodidactic in that he'll teach himself Russian at a very early age. He will ultimately move to Odessa and go into the family business, and it is about 1889 that he will begin to refocus and start writing rather profusely for the Hebrew newspapers. His probably best known work, right, was an article that he wrote called Lo Ze Haderech, and this too we are going to read inside as well, as it is often referred to as the beginnings of what is known as cultural Zionism. A work that probably in its time got more press than Lo Ze Haderech is the reviews that he will write later on in the 1890s, because he will actually visit these new communities, and then he will publish some pretty scathing critiques of what he sees happening in the land of Israel as these new settlements are getting up and off the ground. So Lo Ze Haderech appears in this edition of the Hebrew newspaper Hamelitz, and let's read a little bit of it together. He is talking here about the idea of individuality versus nationality in Jewish culture and, to some degree, tradition. But since on the political side there was a continuous decline, that is, Jews lost political power over the course of history, the religious life grew correspondingly stronger, and concurrently the individualist element in the individual members of the nation prevailed more and more over the nationalist element, and drove it ultimately from its last stronghold, the hope for a future redemption. Let me explain what he means. He means at some point in the past, and again, this is part of this romantic revivalist type of culture. And at some point in the past, we had a Jewish people who had a very strong culture, and they had a very strong nation. Right? We had Torah, we had our Judaism, and we had a government that dealt with, that created a sense of nationality and dealt with things that nations deal with. Well, the national part begins to decline. Right? And as the national part declines, we no longer have political power. The only thing left is our religious life, right, which takes on more and more of importance, he will argue, in Jewish life. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but what he sees happening within the religious world, within the religious life and cultural life of Judaism, is he said, you used to have parts of our tradition that were also very much nationalist. Right? They would bring the entire Jewish people together 3 times a year. Right? The whole Jewish people would come together in Jerusalem. We had a king, right, which had his own parts of the religion that pertained to him. We had things like Kohanim and Leviim, which were national institutions that emphasized sort of the national character of the Jewish people. Well, without the nation, now all we have left is not just the religious piece, but the individualistic elements. This is about me and my avodas Hashem, me and my relationship with Hashem. The idea that I'm part of some larger nation the importance of that begins to dwindle again in his estimation. Yes.
He wrote in Hebrew. Who is his target audience?
His target audience are the
the traditional Queens spoke Yiddish or German. They didn't speak all their local languages. They didn't speak Hebrew. True that the educated people could read and write the Hebrew.
Yeah. So that's a great question. He is writing primarily for the educated, for the educated members of Eastern European, and to some degree these are read in Western Europe also. He is writing for the educated elite, right? For sure, because he wants them to be the harbingers of a cultural revival, right, amongst the Jewish people. That's what he's looking for. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's just finish that argument, right? His argument is that even what he calls the last stronghold of the nationalist sentiment in Jewish religion was Mashiach. Was that at times of Mashiach, we would return to the land of Israel, right? We will again become a nation, kibbutz, goliot, right? We'll all come back and so he says, even there, that has been banished. Why? That hope, here it is. That hope, the heartfelt yearning of a nation seeking in a distant future what the present could not give, ceased in time to satisfy people in its original form, which looked forward to a messianic age, differing from the life today in nothing except the emancipation of Israel from servitude. Who is he quoting here? Okay, good, right? This is the approach of the Rambam, that the messianic age won't be anything different than what we experience today, except that we will have our own sovereignty, our own destiny in our own hands. Right? We've strayed from that. For living men and women no longer found any comfort for themselves in the abundance of good, which was to come to their nation in the latter end of days, when they would be dead and gone. Each individual demanded his own private and personal share of the expected general happiness. And religion went so far as to satisfy even this demand by laying less emphasis on redemption and than on the resurrection of the dead. Again, in his analysis, what's happened even in the religious world, right, is that we started with this vision of Yemot HaMashiach, which was a nationalist idea, right? Kibbutz Goliot, right? The return of the exiles, the recreation of a Jewish nation, and that's been de-emphasized. And what's been emphasized now is Trias HaMesim. I'm going to come back, right? I'm going to be able to exist in this world again. It's all about me as an individual because we've lost the sense of the importance of the Jewish people as a nation. Okay, because of time, we're going to push forward a little bit, right? And here's the sentence by which this is known. Right? He will look at what is happening in the land of Israel, and he'll say, "We've just got it wrong." The rush to send people to Israel to create these small settlements was backward. He understands, right, where it came from, but it was a mistake because the roots aren't there. Right? You've tried to plant something without nurturing its roots first, and if you do that, it will never grow. It certainly won't withstand any type of hardship. So rather, this is the wrong way. Certainly seeing that these ruins are already there, we are not at liberty to neglect the task of mending and improving so far as we can. We got to take care of the people who are there for sure. But at the same time, we must remember that it is not on these that we base our hope of ultimate success. The heart of the people, that is the foundation on which the land will be regenerated, and the people is broken into fragments. So let us return to the road on which we started when our idea first arose. Instead of adding yet more ruins, let us endeavor to give the idea itself strong roots and to strengthen and deepen its hold on the Jewish people, not by force, but by the Spirit. Then we shall have in time have the possibility of doing actual work. What is his plan? His plan is to grow the cultural identity of the Jewish people. It is time for them to understand who we are as a people, what our history is, what our roots are. We need to grow that nationalist sentiment in them so that they feel like they're part of a people. And only then can we start talking about sending people to the land, right? Because the only way they're going to survive in that land is if they feel some sort of deeper connection to that land. To go there simply because they're being chased out of Russia, simply because they can't make a living in Odessa, That's never going to work, because the minute they can't make a living in Israel, they're going to leave there too. We need to strengthen their connection. Now, does their connection mean that they have to be 100% Shomrei Torah or mitzvahs? No. In Achad Ha'am's initial writings, and we'll see this will change, that is a method. It's one of several. Right? He's okay with people. He's not against those who are religious, but he does not believe that that is the only way, right, that one can feel a connection to Jewish history, Jewish heritage, and thus a connection to the land. Here too, we have these authors showing off their impressive knowledge of Tanakh. Right? He too ends off with a quote from Chumash. This time it is from the bracha that Bilam gives the Jewish people. Right, Erenu v'lo ata, ashirenu v'lo karov. Right, that I shall see it, but not now. I shall behold it, but not yet. Of course, a paragraph that ends, right, v'Yisrael osachayil, that we will ultimately come out victorious. His vision was of a much slower process. He says, Bilu, you have jumped the gun. We are not there yet. What we need to do is send people out to Western Europe. Right? Throughout all of Eastern Europe, we need to strengthen their connection to the Jewish people. Right? And then we can talk about a center, a spiritual center for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, because that's what we need more than anything else. Hence the birth of cultural Zionism. By the early 1890s, there will be a group within Chovevei Tzion who will be advocating for exactly this kind of thing. Now, they have to be a bit secretive. They were not allowed to be doing what they were doing by law in Tsarist Russia. They were advocating for the spread of Jewish culture, modern Jewish culture, both in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. They called themselves the B'nai Moshe, and they appoint Achad Ha'am to be their leader. There was nobody more outspoken on this issue than he. They will have a number of important accomplishments. They will create something called a cheder mitukan in Israel, which is a new type of cheder, a new type of school. It was not an elementary school. It was actually a high school or post-high school, but that was going to include agricultural teachings in it as well. Their group were actually the founders of Rehovot, we know as Rehovot today. They also will create the first Hebrew press in Israel. They will be fiercely opposed by traditionalists and by political Zionists. Political Zionists were those like Pinsker initially, and then by Herzl himself, who saw the Zionist or the Jewish question as a political question. If we have no land of our own, we need a place for refuge. We need a place where we can be safe, and we need to use political means in order to get there. Achad Ha'am did not believe in that at all, very much believed that this was a cultural question. Right? We need to strengthen the education of the Jewish people more than anything. And what ultimately we're looking for is a spiritual center of a new Judaism, or a revitalized Judaism in Israel, not so much a safe haven for all Jews, but he will also be opposed by the traditionalists as well. Okay, here's a good example of why Achad Ha'am and Herzl did not see eye to eye. In 1903, Herzl writes a novel called Alt Neuland, right? And this is part of Achad Ha'am's response. How would a Negro Alt Neuland be any different from a Zionist one? I believe it no exaggeration to say that a few superficial changes would suffice to Africanize Herzl's book completely. Alt Neuland is a novel about an old new land, right? It's about Jews going back to their land. And says Ginsburg, this new land that he's envisioning, it isn't Jewish. It may be a land for Jews, but there's nothing Jewish about it. You could just as easily substitute any other people for his Alt Neuland, and it would be the same. His belief in imitating others without the slightest originality, going to all lengths to avoid anything smacking of national chauvinism, even if this means obliterating a people's nationality, language, literature, and spiritual propensities, making oneself small to show how great, even revoltingly so, is one's tolerance, all is a monkey-like aping of others, with no show of national distinctiveness, the spirit of slavery within freedom, that is cherut b'toch avdut b'toch cherut, the spirit of Western European diaspora is everywhere. Achad Ha'am did not like Herzl's vision of what Israel could be. Right? That was a Western European vision. It was one that had no Judaism in it. For Achad Ha'am, that was completely anathema to what Jews need and ought to be doing. Okay, we have a few more people to introduce you to. Probably most importantly of them is Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever. We mentioned his name earlier. He is born in a small town near Vilna. He will study in Volozhin, under Rav Itzela Volozhin. He serves as the rabbi of a number of different communities before coming to Bialystok, which was a very prominent Jewish community. And he will try to bridge this gap that was emerging between the Maskilim and the traditionalists through his mediation of the two around this issue of Zionism. He will write a series of articles between 1872 and 1874, even before 1881. And he will clearly be influenced by the writings of Rabbi Haskalah, in the sense that he saw this as the beginnings, and Haskalah de Geula, beginnings of a redemptive time, right? And that those first steps need to be taken by human beings. What he also felt strongly about, though, was that this Haskalah de Geula, this beginning process, this Mashiach ben Yosef, he couldn't imagine that that could happen by agency of people who didn't believe in Mashiach. That didn't work for him. He did believe that it could happen amongst people, that we could bring it, but how could people who didn't know anything about Mashiach bring the Mashiach? That didn't work. The calculations didn't add up. In 1881, he will actually become a leader of Chovevei Tzion. He will write a work, a letter that is signed by Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik of Brisk and Eliyahu Chaim Meisel of Lodz, encouraging people to move to Israel, because what they were seeing was that people were going to America, right? And that was they saw as a far greater spiritual danger. So I don't know if we would call that Zionism, right? But it certainly was pushing people in the direction of Israel. In 1882, he will travel to Western Europe and begin to try to get political support for the state of Israel. He's actually credited, right, with bringing Rothschild into the fold as a supporter of the early settlements of Israel. And for those of you who know, I mean, the settlements would not have made it without the support of Rothschild. Right? In 1883, he gathers a group of leaders to elect a central committee of Chovevei Tzion, right? And when he does, right, this schism begins to emerge. Remember this picture? That is Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever. Right? That is Pinsker. That is Rabbi Mohilever. And for the continuation of his entire life, his project will be to keep this group, right, in this larger group of more secularly minded Zionists. All right, I know time is getting late. Following the Katowice conference, so several Rabbanim will now begin to separate themselves from Chovevei Tzion for the reasons that we just saw in that picture. Right? So people like Rabbi Eliezer Gordon of Telz, Chaim Eliezer Vax, Rav David Friedman of Karlin, who were initially very much open to these ideas, will begin to separate themselves. And there are two flashpoints that will emerge in particular in the 1880s. Number one, the settlement of Gedera. The fact that there were reports coming back that people were openly not observant, openly Mechalelei Shabbos. This was very difficult for the leaders of traditional Eastern European Jewry to swallow. And the second was that 1888 into 1889 was going to be a Shemitah year. Right? Now you have these, imagine it, right? You have these fledgling agricultural settlements, right, that are hanging on by a thread. And now comes Shemitah. What do we do? Adding to the problems was that Rothschild will give an ultimatum and say, either we find a solution to this or I'm pulling my money. Rabbi Mohilever, not saying he's only responding to the political pressure, but will be the first author of what we know today as the Heter Mechira, that there is a way to get around this by selling your land to non-Jews, and therefore you can continue to work it and continue to benefit from it over the course of the Shemitah. Right? At this point, support for Zionism now becomes a halachic issue, right? And it will very much divide the camps. So this work, published in 1892, very much represents the feelings of traditional Jewry about Zionism in the 1880s. And I know that because when I look at the Haskamas in the beginning, I see that the first Haskama, which was written by Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Rosh Yeshiva of the largest yeshiva in the world at the time, right, the head of Volozhin, writes the first Haskama, and he's dating it 1890. So the book was only published in 1892, but it reflects the opinions of the Rabbanim of Europe from the 1880s. And if you look through this is a collection of letters written by various Rabbanim, laying out their feelings about the early Zionist movement, mostly pro. This work was intended to gain support for the Zionist movement, but also laying out some of their concerns with the matter as well. I can't go through the whole list with you now because of time, but here you see Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, you see Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. It was literally a who's who of the major Rabbanim, even some from Western Europe, like Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer. You see Rabbi Shmuel Mohilber here, Shimon Sofer. The major Rabbanim of the time, all collected in one place. And this is really what you begin to see. The support for Israel comes or for these new settlements, becomes in a few different forms. There are those who believe this is the Haskalah, the Geula, it's the beginning of the redemption. There are those who believe, and this was very much the opinion of the Netziv, that the early settlements in Israel, resettling Israel, should be supported simply because there are greater opportunities for the performance of mitzvah. There's greater opportunities for greater kedusha, greater connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, we should be living in the land of Israel if we can be. Number three, there were others who simply saw this as hatzalas nefashos, that if we can create agricultural, self-sustaining agricultural communities in Israel, Jews can have a way of living, right? And again, even in the religious world, right? This was seen as something that was tzedakah in its greatest sense, right? Perhaps even saving people's lives, right? And there are definitely those who felt that at the very least, it's better than going to America, right? On the opposing side, there were those who begin to articulate that Geula can't come by means of secular leadership. Right? We understood. We were all for scholars who were saying this is the Haskalah of the Geula. But then you look at people like Echad Ha'am and Dr. Leon Pinsker, and this is not Mashiach. Right? This is not our vision for Mashiach. Right? And this couldn't be the way. Second was the fact that some of these settlers were now openly being Mechali Shabbos, Mechali Kashrus. And the third part is that even those who felt that this would be a means of hatzalas nefashos, once they started encountering real significant challenges, actually acquiring any land or creating these communities, they felt like, well, then why should I continue to support this? It's not going anywhere, right? Maybe we redouble our efforts here, and among some, maybe we even look to create Torah communities in the United States of America, where we could actually perhaps make a living and support ourselves, because it's not happening in Israel. And the last part, which becomes a really part of this early story, is their concern over what will happen to the Chalukah system. Chalukah system was a system by which funds were raised for the community in the land of Israel throughout the diaspora. And that was generally divided up, right? A portion of it went to those who were learning Torah, a portion of it went to the almanos, right? And a portion, I forget where the third portion went right now, but like something like the Kupas Meir Balanese is probably the best known. Right? These had existed for 100 years already. People raising money for these communities in Israel. There was a fear that if we start now to go out and say, well, no, we need you to send money to Rishon LeZion and to Gedera, right? The funds are no longer going to come in for what was known as the old Yishuv, right? And their support base is going to drop. And as a result, right, that will do more harm than good. So in 1892, those who did remain as part of Chovevei Tzion wanted it to be successful from the religious camp, sought to create a spiritual center within Chovevei Tzion in order to counter particularly the activity of the Bnei Moshe. The activity of the Bnei Moshe, those who were aligned with Echad Ha'am, was seen as particularly particularly dangerous because they were arguing for spirituality, because they wanted Judaism, but a different kind of Judaism, right? A new revitalized Judaism. The traditionalists and the religious camp saw that as far more dangerous than people who, like Pinsker, who weren't arguing, right, for any kind of Judaism necessarily. They were just looking for a political solution. So it was felt that in order to keep the religious Jews within the folds of Chovevei Tzion, we need to create something that was focused on bringing religious Jews into Chovevei Tzion. They called it the Merkaz Ruchani, which abbreviated is Mizrahi. Oh, okay. Good. As the 1890s go on, Achad Ha'am becomes more openly radical, talking about changes that he imagines will happen over time as Jews resettle, as this new spiritual revival happens. He even talks about a national reform of halacha that he thinks will happen with time as more Jews move to the land of Israel, and therefore the split between him and the religious opposition becomes even greater. What you do not see early on is the arguments that are often made today in the most radical anti-Zionist religious circles, which is the article based on the idea of the Shalosh Shavuos, right, that it was that we're not allowed, right, that we've taken an oath, right, that prevents us from resettling the land of Israel. You will not see that early on. It will come. That's a later development. But the real vocal opposition really becomes through the organ of this newspaper. Yes, the more Orthodox circles, including the Hasidic world, will now take up Hebrew press. Right? They will start their own Hebrew press to rival those of the Maskilim. So Machzikei Adas and then Kol Machzikei Adas becomes the organ and the mouthpiece for the most vocal opposition of early Zionism, which is seen at this point. Now that Achad Ha'am is writing what he's writing, right? The Moshe is doing what they're doing. They make the equation between Zionism and Haskalah. Haskalah at this point, which again by the 1890s has really separated from the traditional world. Haskalah equals Zionism. Therefore, we in the traditionalist camp must oppose. Last figure I'm going to introduce you to is Rabbi Yaakov Reines. Yitzchak Yaakov Reines is a Talmud of Volozhin. He studied in Volozhin, then Aishashak, then becomes a rabbi in a town near Vilna. In 1877, he is part of the group that will found the Kollel Prushim in Kovna, together with a man we met 2 lectures ago by the name of Yisrael Salanter. In 1880, he will publish a work called Chotem Tochnit, which begins to lay out sort of the logical underpinnings of Torah Shebaal Peh. What does this sound like? Which group of people that we've met before? The Maskilim, particularly where? In Galicia, remember, it's Tzvi Hirschchayes, right? They're not quite German, right? But this is kind of what's happening in Galicia in the 1820s and 1830s, right? And here you have Yaakov Reines, right, who's writing a work that seems almost a little academic in its description of some of the things that happen in Torah Shebaal Peh. Good. In 1882, he will immediately join Chibat Zion. Right? He is motivated far more by practical and political considerations. He does not see a future for the Jewish people, religious or not religious, in Eastern Europe. In 1882, though, he will open a yeshiva that will incorporate secular studies. Right? This, too, was a pragmatic decision. He saw what was happening to the Jewish people, right? The poverty, right? The oppression, and felt like if we don't start giving them some way to make a living, right, that's going to be the end, right? We're not going to make it. And so he actually publishes in another religious newspaper, Halavanon, he publishes his program, right? The syllabus that's expected for this, for his school. And you can see in each one of these, it's spelled out year by year. This is the curriculum for his yeshiva for each year, and you can see, right, what they'll be learning in terms of Sifrei Kodesh, and then each year, right, so Machlaket HaShniyah, right, Ksubos, Gittin, Kedushin, Nidarim, Shvuos, Korot Yisrael, Ad Tom, what does that say? Something with Sifrei Kodesh, right, and then Milimudei Chachol. Dikduk, Svat Eber, Russia, Biktsara, right? And math, right? So he actually spells out a modern curriculum of of study together with real yeshivish learning, right, in Masechtos. What is the name of this yeshiva? Hold on 1 second. So this one actually doesn't go very far. Right? This yeshiva doesn't make it past about a year, and the opposition emerges, and it ultimately has to close. But I'm holding off on the name for a second. In 1885, he'll become the rabbi of a more prominent community called Lida. Right? In 1902, following the merging of Chovevei Zion with the World Zionist Organization, he's going to start a faction within the World Zionist Organization that is also going to work on creating a religious presence in the World Zionist Organization. And of course, he decides to take the same name that Rabbi Mohilliver had created in Chovevei Zion, right? What was the name? Mizrahi. Okay, good. Now, in 1905, as the rabbi in Lida, after he has already assumed his position, right, with Mizrahi in the World Zionist Organization, he will open a yeshiva in Lida, actually putting into place now successfully this time his envisioned curriculum that he had almost 2 decades earlier. In this yeshiva, right, he will hire Rav Shlomo Palachek, known as the Meitzer Eloi, right, to give shir. He will also hire a mashgiach ruchani, which is an advent of what movement? Who introduces the idea of a mashgiach into a yeshiva? The Mussar movement, right? This is something that came along with Rav Yisrael Salanter. He incorporates that into his yeshiva as well, and brings somebody from Novardik to become the Mussar, right? The head of Mussar in his yeshiva as well. And he does, in fact, give this yeshiva a name. He calls it Torah Das. Okay, good. Now we're really going to have fun. Okay, I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad you're still awake, because now is when the fun really starts. Okay, here we go. So if you didn't notice yet, we have been talking about 3 different movements or phenomena in the 19th century. We started by talking about Mussar, and we talked about Haskalah, and then we talked about Zionism. Well, here, right, in Rav Reines, we have somebody, right, who takes from what Rav Yisrael Salanter does, where we said the legacy of his movement was ultimately in the yeshivos that would incorporate Mussar. Well, indeed, right, his yeshiva was one such yeshiva that started to incorporate Mussar into what he was teaching. Well, we also talked about a Haskalah that started in Galicia that was focused on some of the more, I'd say, academic ways of looking at Torah study, was also very much interested in Jewish education and how we were educating young people. And that, of course, will take full form in the Vilna Haskalah, and no question, impacts what happens in his yeshiva in Lida. And of course, we talked about the Zionism of Pinsker and Rabbi Mohilliver, right, which will very much play a role in his work as well. So, and from this work from the yeshiva that he starts, right, several years later in the United States will come a yeshiva called Torah V'das, which is started by graduates or people who had been in his yeshiva in Lida, and they take the same name. But Rav Shlomo Palachek, who was the main Maggid Shir in yeshiva in Lida, does not go to Torah V'das. Rather, he goes. Okay, very good. He goes to Rabbi, what was then known as only as REITs, but Yeshiva University, right? And of course, from his work in the World Zionist Organization comes the Mizrahi, right, that we know today as well. And from Mizrahi, ultimately starts a youth movement known today as Bnei Akiva. But hold on, there's more. Because the Mussar movement, we explained, was an outgrowth of, or a response to, the yeshiva movement. Right? The yeshiva movement, let me see if I can move this. Okay, the yeshiva movement, we noted a few moments ago, and its heyday, right, was the aim ha-yeshivos was Volozhin. Volozhin was headed by a man by the name of the Nitziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Rabbi Berlin was a teacher, right, of Rav Reines as well. He also had another student, perhaps a bit more famous, right, which is Rav Chaim Brisker. Rav Chaim Brisker, of course, was married to his granddaughter also, right, and they were actually co-rosh yeshiva at the end of the by the closing of the Volozhiner yeshiva. So those are the two great architects of the yeshiva world. Again, one of which gives rise to Rabbi as well. But Rav Shlomo Polachek, who will ultimately serve in his yeshiva, is a student of Rav Chaim of Brisk, right? And he's known for his incredible gadlus in Torah, which is why Rav Reinus hires him to teach these rather special students that he has in Lida. But Rav Yisrael Salanter also has a great student by the name of Rav Yitzchak Blazer. Rav Yitzchak Blazer has a student by the name of, very good, Dov Revel. Okay, Dov Revel is a student of Rav Blazer, who's a student of Rav Salanter, but ultimately comes over to the United States, gets his doctorate in Dropsy College in Philadelphia, and then becomes the first president of Yeshiva University. Very good. But for a brief period in the early 1920s, Dov Revel is actually not the president. He has to take a leave of absence. And in his place from 1920 to 1922, steps into the presidency of Yeshiva University, a man by the name of Meir Berlin. Now, Meir Berlin happens to be the son of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Nitziv. Very good. Now, it was the Revel's vision for Yeshiva University that he would bring over one of the great Gedolim of Europe to serve as a Rosh Yeshiva in this yeshiva, to bring the Torah of Europe to the United States. But it was actually Rabbi Berlin who succeeds in bringing Rabbi Polachek over to Yeshiva University. Now, Rabbi Berlin, of course, goes on to become a great leader in Mizrahi. Okay? And once he does, he will then move to Israel. He will change his last name to Bar Ilan. Oh. And from there we get the University of Bar Ilan. Okay, we could keep going, right? But here's the last one. Right? The last one goes like this. The Nitziv has another son. Right? His name is, okay, well, see, there's the yeshiva in Brooklyn at the very same time. That's called Yeshiva Ateres Bachrim. I believe it starts in 1904. But when Rabbi Chaim Berlin, who is the Rav of Yerushalayim, never comes to the United States, but is a Rav of Yerushalayim, when he dies, it will actually be Meir Berlin who suggests to the head of Yeshiva Ateres Bachrim that they change their name from Yeshiva Ateres Bachrim to, oh, you guys are such a good audience. Ah! There it is. Okay, good. Yes. All right, there we go. So we have Mizrahi, Bar Ilan, Bnei Akiva, YU, Chaim Berlin, and Yeshiva Torah Vadas, right? All coming from the very same place, or at least somewhere close. All right, so let's wrap this then up. Here we go. We have talked about this century of the 19th century, right? A time which saw this explosion of population of Jews from 0 in Russia to 5.2 million, right? That happens over the course of these various czars, particularly focused with these Nicholas I and Alexander II. We first painted this background. We noted that over the course of this time will be pockmarked, right, by a series of revolutions, first here in the Western world, and then throughout Europe, both in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, and then these nationalist revolutions, which are unsuccessful, which happened in the middle of the century. This was the canvas on which we began to tell the story of what's happening in Eastern Europe. A program that starts with intended Russification, an attempt to make Jews more like Russians, because Russians were dealing with this Jewish problem they had that was a subset of their Polish problem that came from having taken on this huge swath of territory in the end of the 18th century. So they begin this program of Russification, a program which takes on its most intensive form during the time of Tsar Nicholas, under the direction of Sergei Uvarov, the Minister of Education. Then, though, there will be a dramatic shift, right? At the end of Nicholas's reign, as a result of the Crimean War, serfdom will be abolished. There will be a dramatic shift towards the more liberal, which ultimately will last for about a decade or two. And then with the end of Alexander II's reign, things will change once again with the May laws that will make things far more restrictive for Jews again. This was the background on which we told the story first of of the Mussar movement, of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter coming to Vilna in the 1840s, and the impact that he will have on Jewish thinking and Jewish learning. Right from that point forward, we said that ultimately his legacy lies less in his impact in his amongst the Balabatim in his community, and more about the impact that he will have on the yeshivos that will open up later on. We said, though, that very often history books will tell this story as being related to the Enlightenment, that this was a response to things that were happening in Western Europe. We said that, in fact, that wasn't the case, but rather Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and the Muslim movement is a response not to the rise of Hasidus, but to the rise of the yeshiva movement, a movement that had made Talmud Torah so present in the lives of particularly Lithuanian Jewish world, particularly around Vilna. Here you had Jews who were studying Torah more than ever, but you had people who he saw that weren't acting the way in which the Torah said to act. And so he was dealing with this problem of how I overcome, how we go from what we know to what we're actually doing. The reason, though, that Mussar is so often talked about as a contrast to Haskalah is because of what will happen later. Because in these yeshivos, indeed, very much of the talk will begin to be about Haskalah, but that's because of the Vilna Haskalah that will come to fore later in the 19th century. We then told that story and its rise over the course of the late 19th century. We asked why that happened in particular, why the dramatic increase at this point. And so we told the story of the way in which the Western European Haskalah will ultimately impact the Galician Haskalah. That then will come together with the impact of the Russian government at the very same time to create what was known as the Vilna Haskalah. We then told the story of 1881 and the way in which that dashes the hopes, the visions, the dreams that Maskilim had for this European Jewish culture in Europe. And ultimately, we see four different responses. One is mass immigration to the United States. The other is the traditional world turning inside. There are those who go to the more radical sects of Jewish politics. And then, of course, there's the story of the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, and the story which we then told today of early Zionism, all of which come together to create a very different world at the end of the 19th century than we saw at the beginning. Thank you for listening.
Like a little kid instead of dying.
Thank you.
This